Hello everyone, it's good to see you again online. This video lecture is about Paul's early life and his conversion. Let's begin with some words of introduction. At the end of the account in Acts of Stephen's trial and martyrdom, Luke introduces us to a person whose life and mission is going to dominate the larger half of the book of Acts, chapters 13 through 28. His Jewish name, Luke tells us, was Saul, named apparently for the first king of Israel and a member of his family's tribe, the tribe of Benjamin. But we know him better from his Roman or Latin name, Paulus, translated into English, Paul. Paul's conversion, which is the traditional name given to Paul's encounter with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, and the missionary journeys that followed that are foundational events in the book of Acts. From them, the story in Acts says, came the growth and spread of the gospel, and communities of people who came to identify themselves as part of the first churches. Furthermore, as the prologue to Acts says, Luke's gospel was intended by its author to record what Jesus began to do and teach in his life on earth. The book of Acts, then, by implication, is meant to record how Jesus' work continued after his resurrection and ascension, with the help of the apostles, including Paul, as they were guided and inspired by the Holy Spirit. Luke's account in Acts gives us two brief glances back at Saul's life. And then Luke writes about his experience on the road to Damascus and the end of Acts chapter 8 and Acts chapter 9. In Acts chapter 8 and verse 1, we learn about one of the glances back at Paul's previous life. We learn that he was present at the stoning of Stephen. And we can likely infer that he was present at Stephen's trial that preceded his stoning, and that he heard Stephen's speech, the one that Luke records in Acts chapter 7. The second glance back in Paul's life, at his early life, is in Acts 9 and verses 1 and 2, where we learn that sometime after Saul was present at Stephen's stoning, he was still someone who could be described as a man breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. Both of those texts in Acts, the one at Stephen's stoning and the one at the beginning of Acts chapter 1 and verses 1 and 2, both those texts seek to demonstrate Saul's character to us in a way that is typical of Luke in the book of Acts. For often in the book of Acts, Luke will write a brief vignette, a very quick description of something or someone, and then pass on to what he really wants to talk about and expand the part of the story that he really wants you to notice. But the early texts in Acts at Stephen's stoning and in the beginning of chapter 9 are vignettes of Saul, portraying him as someone intensely loyal to Judaism and the Torah, as well as someone who was seeking to come from the background to the forefront as an opponent of any form of belief in Jesus as the Messiah. Luke's brief glances back at Saul's life can and should be enlarged and substantiated by Paul's own words in his letters and in the book of Acts. So let's turn to those now and look at some key texts. I want to look with you at 5 key texts. The first is found in Acts 21, the second in Acts 22, the third in Acts 26, and then 2 texts from Paul's letters, the first in Galatians 1 and 2, and the second in Philippians 3. According to Acts 22 and verse 3, Saul was born in the city of Tarsus, which at the time of his birth, circa or around 8 to 10 AD, was part of the Roman province of Cilicia. The territory had been under Roman rule for about 70 years when Saul was born. During the whole of his life, the city of Tarsus, Saul's birthplace, was the provincial capital of Cilicia and probably its most important city. The status of Tarsus derived first of all from its commercial value. It had a prime location, on the Sindus River. It was 30 miles south, more or less, of a major pass through the Taurus Mountains, from what we would call the eastern plateau of eastern Turkey today to the western coastal plain and the Mediterranean Sea, right at that juncture, right as that pass came down. A prosperous city, Tarsus was known in particular for its textiles. They were woven there, and especially for two kinds of cloth: Tarsian linen, which was said to be the coolest kind of linen that you could find in the ancient world, and a water-repellent cloth, kind of an ancient Gore-Tex, called silicium. It was woven from goat's hair, and it was used to make tents that were waterproof. Tarsus also had a reputation for itself as a city where education and philosophy and other forms of Greco-Roman culture flourished. In Saul's own words, spoken to the Roman tribune who rescued him from the mob about to stone him in the temple in Acts 21, Tarsus was no mean city. In Saul's own letters, in Philippians 3 and verse 5, he tells us he was born of Jewish parents who were members of the tribe of Benjamin. And this explains his Hebrew name and perhaps some of his pride. For he was named by his parents for Israel's first king, Saul, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. We'll say something more about his Roman or Latin cognomen, Paulus or Paul, and his Roman citizenship next. If we move back to Acts, this time to the end of Acts 22, Paul tells the centurion, after he'd been taken from the temple and was about to be flogged, that he is a Roman citizen. Here's the text from Acts 22. But when they had tied him up with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who's uncondemned?" When the centurion heard that, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? This man's a Roman citizen." The tribune came and asked Paul, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he said, "Yes." The tribune answered, "It cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship." Paul said, "But I was born a citizen." Immediately those who were about to examine him drew back from him, and the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. What actually is happening in that text is the tribune was testing Paul. When the tribune says, "It cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship," I suspect that that was not true. For it is true that citizenship could be purchased for a large sum of money, but for those who were born from Roman citizens, as this tribune likely was, they acquired their citizenship by birth. And so when the tribune says to Paul, "It cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship," he's testing Paul, expecting Paul to say the same thing. But Paul says what a true Roman citizen would say: "I was born a citizen." And I suspect he says it with a twinkle in his eye, because he knows the tribune is trying to test him. In any case, the right of citizenship was highly valued in the Greco-Roman world all across the empire. How the right of citizenship was originally obtained by Saul's family before he was born, we don't know. But citizenship could have been granted to his family because they were tent makers, in gratitude perhaps for their service through their gifts to the Roman army or in some other way. What we do know is that Saul's Roman citizenship was something that he greatly valued, and that its privileges and protections were something that he called on during his missionary journeys, his imprisonments, and his trials. In addition, with his citizenship, he also acquired what's called a Roman cognomen, cognomen, a Latin name, Paulus, or translated into English, Paul, which may well have been his father's name before him. To take a father's name as a cognomen was common among Roman citizens. The privileges and protections of Roman citizenship had been laid down in a series of Roman laws dating back to the formation of the Republic in 509 BC. They included the right to an impartial and public trial for any citizen accused of a crime. That's a right that Paul makes use of in Acts 16. It also included exemption from certain dishonoring or humiliating forms of punishment. That's a right Paul makes use of in the text I just read to you from Acts 22. And Roman citizenship also included protection against summary execution or mob violence. That's a right that Paul makes use of in Acts 23. In Philippians 3 and verse 6, Paul describes himself as a Hebrew born of Hebrews. F. Bruce, a noted New Testament scholar, has pointed out both Luke and Paul's reserve those words for conservative Hebrew or Aramaic-speaking Jews, in contrast to Hellenistic or Greek-speaking Jews, who were generally more open and accepting of Greek and Roman influence. Bruce writes, and I'm quoting now, "The distinction was cultural and linguistic. Hebrews attended synagogues where the service was conducted largely, if not wholly, in Hebrew, and their children were taught Hebrew. Hellenists spoke Greek and attended synagogues where the scriptures were read and prayers recited in Greek, and their children, though learning some Hebrew, would probably not have been fluent in it." That's the end of the quote. In the dispersion, the Hellenists would be the majority of resident Jews, while the Hebrews would be either recent immigrants from Israel, or more likely in Paul's case, members of families which made a special point of preserving their Jewish ways. It's likely then that Paul was brought up by conservative Jewish parents who sought for their son a real knowledge and loyalty to the laws, traditions, customs, and culture of Judaism. As far as we know, Paul had no brothers, although he did have a sister, who's referred to in Acts chapter 23 and verse 16. In accordance with all of this, we learn a bit more about Paul's family when he tells us in a speech Luke records in Acts 23 that not only was he himself a Pharisee, but he was also, and I'm quoting now the words from Acts, a son of Pharisees. Those words mean that his father at least was a Pharisee before him, and probably his grandfather as well, or his father's brothers. As the son of a Pharisee, Saul was apparently the one that his father wished be sent to Jerusalem. Acts 23 and verse 16 says that's where he was sent, and he studied at the school of the Rabbi Gamaliel, who's called in rabbinical literature later on Gamaliel the First or Gamaliel the Elder. We know Gamaliel was one of the leading rabbis of his day, for according to the Mishnah, and I'm quoting now from Mishnah Sota, chapter 9:15, when Rabbi Gamaliel the Elder died, the glory of the Torah ceased, and purity and separateness died. The concern for purity, the concern to separate oneself as a Pharisee from the Am Haaretz, that's a Hebrew word for people who lived on the land but did not study or honor the Torah as completely or perfectly as possible. The decision to set one's life apart to discover the glory of the Torah through study and show forth that glory through a life of obedience to all the commandments. These were the lessons that Gamaliel, the Pharisaic rabbi, would have passed on to his students. And Saul learned those lessons well, for as he says of himself in Galatians 1 and verse 14, "I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age." But when a messianic group who followed a blasphemous rabbi from Galilee named Jesus continued to proclaim him God's Son after he was tried and condemned and crucified, Gamaliel took a pragmatic approach, counseling patience, according to Acts 5. He said, I tell you, keep away from these men. Let them alone for this plan or undertaking. If it's of men, it will fail, but if it's of God, you won't be able to overthrow them." But Saul took another kind of approach, breathing out, as Luke says in chapter 9 and verse 1, threats and murder against the followers of Jesus, and demonstrating his zeal for the Torah by asking the religious authorities in Jerusalem and the high priest for letters to go to Damascus and arrest Jesus' followers, so they could be returned to Jerusalem and stand trial before the religious authorities, just as Jesus had done for their blasphemous allegiance to one who dared to call himself the Son of God. A love for Torah, a zeal for purity, a desire to see the glory of the Torah studied and lived out in his own life, the kind of obedience that separated him and set him apart from many other Jews who did not take their religion so seriously. These were the trademarks of Saul's early life as he sought to follow God's calling to him as a Pharisee. But now our survey of Saul's early life has brought us back to Acts chapter 9 and a journey that Saul began in order to persecute the followers of the way. And we'll say more about that in the next video.